So we're going to start talking about the Catholic Church in America now, and the Catholic Church is larger than any other single religious institution in America. This has long been the case, as you can see from this graphic. I mean, this is just, covering the early 21st century, but the numbers remain pretty stable into the past where, for instance, here in between 2003 and 2017, that you see that the Protestants taken together have lost 14% of their market share. In terms of adherence, Catholics remain the same, and so they've remained pretty consistent throughout history. Catholics retain that sort of the largest single institutional body, which this is the case because Protestants, which we think of as the majority and taken together, retain their majority even in 2017 and since then. The Protestant world is actually a really diverse bunch, and we will get to them after Catholics next. But a little over 20% of Americans are Catholic. 10 to 15% of the American population is comprised by former Catholics, folks who, from within the Catholic vision, would be understood as lapsed Catholics or fallen Catholics. Former Catholics, folks who were in the Catholic Church and left. That's about 10 to 15% of the American population. And you think, well, how is it that 10 to 15% of the American population are former Catholics, and yet the Catholic numbers remain the same? And there's reasons for that. Catholics, statistically speaking, still tend to reproduce at higher rates than most other religious groups, not all, but most. And also there's a great deal of Catholic immigration, especially today, and we'll talk about immigration in the 19th century in a bit, but in the 21st century world, Catholic immigration tends to come from the Latin American countries, Central and South America, Mexico primarily, but also Honduras and other Latin American countries. So between reproduction rates and immigration rates, that's kind of how that number stays level, despite the fact that a pretty significant chunk of the population are former Catholics. And you can see also by the 2017 numbers that no religion or none of the above, folks who choose not to affiliate, have in 2017 come very close to the Catholic numbers. Well, since then they have surpassed it, so by sort of a fraction of a percentage point. Now the none of the above or no religious affiliation folks sit pretty much neck and neck in terms of population numbers with Catholics. Okay, so Catholics are split. We're going to do a kind of general overview before we touch on history. Catholics are split between Democrats and Republicans pretty evenly. And we see here two graphics of that just from the 2020 presidential election and a couple years before that. Politically speaking, Democrats and Republicans, it slices right down the middle of the Catholic population, although in terms of all Catholics, but it does tend, that you can see in the graphic on the left, that for the 2020 election, the majority of white Catholics supported Donald Trump, whereas the greater majority of Hispanic Catholics supported Joe Biden, which makes some sense based on policies, especially regarding immigration and the border, but also kind of, as we'll see in the next lecture, really pushes back against this notion that Catholics vote in bloc as Republicans on matters of single issue, especially abortion. That pushes back hard on that. So anyway, Catholics, this is just to say, it's not a monolithic group. Catholics are split pretty evenly down the middle of political party affiliation. Also racially and ethnically diverse. A great, one of the things that keeps the American Catholic population growing is its enrichment by, especially immigration from Latin American or Hispanic countries. So there's an increase in Latino Catholics in America, but as a whole, they're racially and ethnically diverse. They're pretty evenly distributed across the country. That is, Catholics are kind of everywhere. They're more densely represented in states like Massachusetts and California and Texas, border states, but also seaboard states, but they're throughout. And more than half of American Catholics really believe that the church should change. So this is an interesting graphic. It's from some years back, 2015, but it really shows the degree to which Catholics don't necessarily agree with the doctrinal hierarchy. And we'll see that Catholicism is a Christian group that is hierarchically governed and has a set dogma that supposedly Catholics throughout the world agree to adhere to. Well, it turns out American Catholics in particular, don't agree. They say the Catholic Church should change in a number of ways, should allow priests to marry, should accept the LGBTQ plus population, should allow women to become priests, should accept divorce, should allow birth control. You see that 76% believe that Catholics should be allowed to use birth control. And the lowest divergence here is recognize gay and lesbian marriage. That's at 46%, nearly half of the Catholic population. But this is just an indicator. All to say, the Catholic population in America is not as monolithic as the Vatican hierarchy might prefer. It's not as conservative or single issue as it's often portrayed to be, especially by non-Protestant news media. But like every group, it's incredibly internally diverse. And why we need to say this? It may be because the Catholic Church really is governed hierarchically, as we said, from the Vatican. This is an image of the Vatican. You're kind of looking at two perspectives on the same scene. It's the Catholic Church is governed hierarchically from the Vatican, and it's here that we'll start. This is what we see here is on the right, Pope Francis waving to not the most enormous crowd that you'll ever see in the Vatican, but it really is understood that Catholic dogma does kind of descend from a top point down, from the Vatican and down to every local parish, so that every local parish around the world is being governed by the same set of doctrinal laws. That's the idea behind the Roman Catholic hierarchy, behind the papacy itself. Now, it doesn't necessarily play out that way, as we've seen, but let's turn to the American context. Early American Catholics faced an enormous amount of discrimination based primarily on the belief that Catholicism would not be compatible with the American commitment to religious freedom, to a secular government, to the democratic principles. Non-Catholics didn't trust Catholics to be authentic participants in the American social contract. They believed that Catholics would privilege the Pope over the Constitution, that it would be difficult to maintain allegiance to two governing ideologies, and that the religious ideology would take precedence. So there was a certain amount of distrust in the non-Catholic world looking at Catholics saying, well, I'm not sure you can actually separate your commitment to democratic equality from whatever it is that the Pope in Rome tells you, and the Pope in Rome has nothing to do with American politics. That was the logic, right? But Catholics have been around for a long time. Maryland was founded as kind of a refuge for Catholics. It was a colony founded as a refuge for Catholics who, by the way, have not, since the earliest colonial moment, ever made up anywhere near a majority of the population there. But it was founded in 1632 and then officially in 1634, from when they got the paperwork to when they stamped it. In 1649, and this is kind of where Maryland comes into our story, other than being a colony dedicated to Catholics, and this is where you get the name Maryland, right? It comes from Mary, the mother of Jesus. All Christians have a certain relationship to this mythic narrative that there is Jesus, understood to be the Son of God within the Christian framework, and his mother is Mary. Well, the Catholics put in a special emphasis on not worship of Mary, but veneration. Kind of a hyper-veneration is what it's known theologically, but an emphasis on the role of Mary as an intermediary. So you get prayers dedicated to her, devotionals dedicated to her. You can think of, Our Lady of Guadalupe, whom we won't really look at, but we should, maybe we will, which is the vision of Mary and the apparition of Mary that appeared within the Americas in Mexico and became the patron saint of the Americas, among other things. But Mary has a heightened importance in the Catholic world compared to the Protestant world, to the degree to which Protestants, looking at Catholics and wanting to call them names, one of the names that Catholics were called was Mariolaters, which means, worshipers of Mary, right? And so, and this is from the Catholic perspective. Catholics would say, no, that's not what's going on. But that was Maryland. Maryland is named after Mary for good reason, in that for the Catholic population, Mary, the mother of Jesus, has an elevated spiritual position. Okay. So there's that. But there's also this moment that happened in 1649 when the Maryland Toleration Act was passed. It was called an Act Concerning Religion, and for its time, it was an incredibly liberal document, right? And it will not read that way to us, right? It will not look like that to us. But it was a really very early effort to ensure religious freedom. Now, this makes sense, right? Because the Catholics who founded the colony but remained a minority, found it really important to assert and defend religious rights, so that they wouldn't lose the freedoms that they had established the colony to protect, right? So they came out on the forefront of really a great deal of the religious freedom documents. The law concerning religion, the Maryland Toleration Act, became part of what led to part of the bookshelf that was considered in the writing of the First Amendment, among other things. Now, like I said, it's not going to look liberal to us today. It might not look altogether liberal, and by that I mean it's not going to look liberal at all, this document. For one thing, whoever blasphemes or denies or curses God shall be punished by death. That comes up early, right? And all of his property will be confiscated, right? So if you curse God, you'll be killed and we'll take your land and all your goods, right? So that doesn't seem terribly liberal. But further, and this is where you do get the kind of liberalizing tendency, anyone who insulted or reproached another person based on religious grounds would be fined, steeply fined. So they give a whole list, right? You can't call somebody a this or that or a this or that. You can't call them a papist or a heretic or a schismatic or an independent or a Baptist if you do so in a derogatory way, right? And if you're going to be insulting other people based on their religious grounds, well, then we're going to fine you. We're going to fine you steeply. It prescribed a religious tolerance at a time when that was not considered required or normal. It did so within a Trinitarian Christian frame. That's important to know. So it was absolutely toleration within a certain context, right? If you're a Trinitarian Christian, then it doesn't matter what kind of Trinitarian Christian you are. You get all of the rights and privileges pertaining to that status, right? So what does that mean, Trinitarian Christian? It means the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, variously defined, but this notion that God is a Trinity, right? So most Christians in the world today are Trinitarian Christians, right? There are Unitarian movements, and those folks are not Trinitarian. But most, in the Catholic and the Protestant and the Orthodox worlds, the vast majority of Christians are Trinitarian. So it was within the Christian context exclusively a wide net was cast for tolerance, which we know tolerance is a pretty low bar to begin with, by the way. I tolerate you is never going to be something that you're going to be like, wow, that's really cool. I feel really respected, and, my dignity as an individual is really, fed by that and enriched. No, it's not. It's a very low bar, and we should know that. Toleration or tolerance is like low bar, but at the time, it was not. So long as you were a Trinitarian Christian, you were protected, and the Sabbath was protected. So residents were fined for working unnecessarily on the Sabbath, or for being drunk and disorderly on the Sabbath, or for disrespecting the Sabbath really in any way. So that kind of Sabbatarian principle, right? On the seventh day he rested, says Genesis, referring to God, and we talked last time about Judaism, and in the vast majority of the Jewish world, and traditionally in the Jewish world, the Sabbath is considered to be Friday night when the sun sets to Saturday night when the sun sets, right? So it's really kind of begins in the evening and ends in the evening, but it's Saturday Sabbath, right? So why is it that Christians celebrated on Sunday? Did they count the days differently, right? You think about a calendar, the way it's printed. Sunday always comes at the beginning. It's kind of day one, right? And then if on the seventh day is supposed to be the Sabbath, well then, why is Sunday number one? Why does the Christian world not celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday along with the Jewish world? And there's an answer to that. Theologically speaking, Christians very early on reinterpreted that Sabbatarian principle, or this, the role of the Sabbath in the life of the faithful. In the Christian world, they said, well, with the resurrection of Christ, that was the eighth day, right? We're now so like Christians understand themselves to practice the Sabbath on the eighth day, which is also the first day of a 7-day week, which is Sunday. So there are certain Christian groups, whom we'll get to later in the semester, like Seventh-day Adventists, who say, no, we're going to do the Sabbath on Saturday, which is the seventh day. All a side point. Back to America, back to early Catholics. This is Archbishop John Carroll, early American, first archbishop in America, and he advocated the vernacular, Mass being said in English, right? He wanted priests to be able to say Mass. At this point, Mass was said in Latin, right? The Mass was the same no matter where you went on earth, because every Mass was said in Latin. This guy in 1787 advocated a vernacular Mass. He said, we really need to start saying Mass in English so that people can understand. That wouldn't happen until the 1960s with Vatican II, 1964. A day that was very significant for practicing Catholics because in November of 1964, you went into Mass, and for the first time ever, all of a sudden the priest was facing you, and he was speaking in your language, right? That had never happened before. In the experience of Catholics, the priest would always face the altar, right? And would, say the Mass on behalf of the parishioners who sat behind him and mostly didn't listen at all, right? Mostly they said their own, they did their own devotionals, they said their own prayers, they, said their own rosaries in their own language, in their own vernacular. It was kind of a loud scene, right? The priest would be facing the altar and doing what he did in Latin, and the whole crowd would be kind of abuzz with like saying their prayers. And the reason, if anyone's been to a Catholic Mass, when the priest elevates the Eucharist, right, or raises the cracker up to bless it and say, recite some words from the biblical text, this is my body. The altar boys, or now altar girls, ring the bells, right? And the reason they do that traditionally is that traditionally in a Latin Mass, nobody's paying attention anyway. So they ring the bells so that everyone knows to look up from their individual prayers and see the raising of the elevation of the Eucharist, right? So it's an important moment. It's when the sacramental miracle occurs for the Catholic worldview, right? For Catholics, that moment is understood to be its own sacramental miracle, to transform the cracker into the body of Christ. It's not symbolic in the Catholic world. It's understood to be a miracle, right? Well, they needed to watch it, right? So ring, 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 and everyone goes, oh yeah, that's what we're watching, right? And so that moment in Latin gives us a number, which developed in the American context, which we'll get to, of 19th century anti-Catholicism. So let's put this in our mind. When you elevate the Eucharist, the priest, when a priest elevates the Eucharist, he says, "Hoc est meum corpus," right? Like, this is my body, which has been given up for you, right? This is the text that goes through. But when he says "Hoc est meum corpus," what that got translated to in 19th century American anti-Catholicism is such phrases as hocus pocus, which was meant to be like, ooh, magic, right? It's hocus meum corpus. Hocus is just a bunch of hocus pocus, right? That was a way to say Catholics are magically thinking about something that's not really true. Another thing that came out of 19th century American anti-Catholicism, based on the same line, because remember, the priest is facing the other way. His back is to the crowd, and then he turns around, lifts up the Eucharist. Everyone looks at him. Then he turns back around and completes the Mass, the process, and that's where you get the hokey pokey, right? So you do the hokey pokey, and you turn yourself around, and that's what it's all about, right? That's Anyway, fun facts from the anti-Catholicism of the American 19th century. This fellow, in 1787, advocated the vernacular Mass in English, which again would not happen until 1964. And this fellow, next to him, Bishop John England, advocated lay leadership at about the same time, recognizing that there just weren't enough priests around to serve the really widely dispersed Catholic population. There was a lot of land in between, and they didn't have cars, right? So he said, we need lay leadership. We need deacons saying the Mass, which, again, the 20th century would see movements toward that with the increased role of deacons especially. But these were some really early innovators in Catholic doctrine and pastoral kind of rules, right? They were trying to sort of innovate. That will become important. Okay, these are the first American archbishop and bishop, the first American bishops of note, and working within the Catholic hierarchy, within the Catholic frame, and they were, from their position in America, actively trying to innovate to make worship easier for the parishioners, to make it more connected to their lives. We'll get there. And then the 19th century rolls around. So that's late 18th century, 19th century rolls around, and you read about it in your McGreevy article. German and Irish immigrants of especially the 1830s swelled the Catholic population. So what you see on the far left is Irish, and then German, and then you see the colorful graphic on the right is just the U.S. immigration flows by country as a percentage of the American population. This looks different if you do it by straight numbers and not a percentage. But as a percentage, you can see that Ireland and Germany comes a little later. Ireland comes first, right? And you can see that in the black and whites also. They just enormous waves of immigration at that time swelled the Catholic population and led to a kind of really rampant anti-Catholicism, which had a number of effects, hocus pocus and hokey pokey being a couple of them, but also American public schools, which were at that time known as common schools, were established by the feds in large part as a defensive move, not entirely, but in large and very explicit part, in ways that connect to the McGreevy article, right? Because the only education available to many of the Anglo-American children on the frontier was being offered by Catholics. And the Protestants didn't want Catholics educating their kids. And the federal government didn't want Catholics in charge of education because, again, there was this real tension where a question of whether or not you could be an American and also be a Catholic, whether you could be a kind of humanist that the founding documents required within a more or less deist frame, and also be committed to a Catholic hierarchy. There was some doubt there. So they didn't want the Catholics educating their kids on the frontier while they were moving on their Christian mission of Manifest Destiny. More or less Christian mission. That's a simplification. It was not so much a Christian mission. It was far more a mission of land grab and greed. The story of Thomas Wall that you read about is reflective of this tension. Now, I know that this is tiny. You can zoom in, you can pause, you can look at this, you can look it up and find many versions of this graphic, but the Catholic and Protestant Bibles are different, right? And that's kind of what came up in the McGreevy article that you read. They're a little different. The translations are a little different. The Ten Commandments, which you see on the left, are numbered differently. Same deal, but they're like numbered differently, right? And they're taken from different parts. One uses the Deuteronomy, one uses the Exodus. It's all the same book, right? But they're they're choosing to organize it differently and approach it just slightly differently. And on the right, you see that the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, is in the far left, and that gives you the sort of what the Christians will then call the Old Testament, but we will call the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh. And then you see the Roman Catholic and the Protestant, which is primarily what we're talking about here in the context of America. And what you see there is that the Roman Catholic list is longer, right? The Catholic Bibles include the Apocrypha, which is books that are considered of uncertain authorship and not included in Protestant Bibles, so that's different. But these textual issues, these were less pressing, really, than was the underlying ideological tension. Most people didn't know this, right? They knew, like kids, like Thomas Wall knew that the Ten Commandments, as they were translated in the Protestant Bible, were not the ones he had learned, right? He knew enough to when you recite things, well, that's not quite what I recite. It's not what I'm going to recite in this context. But in terms of the image on the right, there was probably a sense, an exaggerated sense of the difference between the two books. The translations were a little bit different. They weren't as different as they were made out to be, I guess is what I want to say. There were some extra books in the Catholic Bible, but that really was less the issue than that underlying ideological tension. The American democracy was founded on the notion that truth existed independently of the individual, that nature and nature's God established an order that could be accessed by the individual, right? That inalienable rights meant that there could be no shared values that were contingent upon a religious authority like the Pope, right? We can't have a religious authority who's determining what will be our shared values. Nature and nature's God established a rational world that we would then seek, out, and certain truths are held to be self-evident, but those are listed very clearly, right? So there was that tension between whether you could accept the founding documents and also accept the Catholic doctrine. The non-Catholic world didn't quite trust that you could do that. So Anglo-Americans living within the Protestant cultural arena believed that their commitment to democracy required a rejection of papal authority, that you'd have to say no to the Pope in order to commit yourself to the American project. And that was really more of the crux of the issue than these textual differences, right? And they believed that Catholics would be loyal to Rome before they were loyal to America. That's what they believed. And it came out in countless political cartoons. These are worth pausing in and, zooming in on. Upper left was a very, it's Thomas Nast who wrote, excuse me, who drew a great many cartoons. But what you see is cardinals. What you see here is cardinals, crawling up on the shore like crocodiles, right? Those are Catholics, right? That's the cardinal hat that represents Catholicism, and all the Anglo children who are huddled in fear. The Protestant children. You can see in the back at the fort there's a upside down American flag, which is meant to signal distress, like oh no, the Catholics are coming, right? And the American River Ganges, which is like the sacred river in India, which it's not likely that American readers had any real connection to that except as something foreign and not Christian, right? Catholics are Christian. Catholics were Christian before the Reformation. Catholics were Christian before the Protestants existed. But there was a Protestant momentum to look at Catholics and think of them as foreign, as other, as somehow not Christian, right? And there's a number, and to call it Romanism, as you see in the bottom right, papism, right, Mariolators, these are all terms that folks would use rather than use Catholic. And then the top right, this kind of speaks to what I'm getting at, especially in terms of the political issues, which is that you have Rome in politics up there, and you can see that his hand, and this is meant to be the Pope, you can see that his hand is reaching through the curtain of religion and kind of getting in on the White House there, I think is what's going on. And it says, shall he be allowed to rule America? And there's this notion that if you elect Catholics into the government, then actually they're going to have a direct line to the Pope, and the Pope is going to be making the laws, right? So there was this real fear that Catholics would compromise democratic freedom, and rumors spread that the Vatican had built tunnels, between underground from Rome to Washington, D.C., right? Papal authority did not do a lot to help matters, is kind of what happened. The middle, the one that's big, we're going to look at this in just a second, so it's worth, this is the papal allocution. He's snuffing out modern civilization. We're going to turn to this in just 1 second, right? The Catholic hierarchy itself worked pretty openly and aggressively against modernism. Okay, let's turn to that. So this fellow, Pope Leo XIII, in 1899, he put out an encyclical, which is a really official letter, and it's got its Latin name there, Testem Benevolentiae, which is its Latin title, in which he condemned Americanism by name, right? It was held that there were two types of Americanism that he described in this letter. There was the good kind, right, which he recognizes, and it's just kind of it's a sort of national identity, a commitment to a unique national identity, which he says every nation has, and of course they should. But then there was the bad kind, which, quote, assumed the right to hold whatever opinions one pleases upon any possible subject and to set them forth in print to the world. So the bad Americanism, the bad kind, the kind that was condemned strongly, as this slide shows us, it assumed the right to hold whatever opinion it chose, and then to print it and spread it. And you think, well, yeah, that's the freedom of the press, and that was a problem for Rome. The problem was that when opinions about freedom, about the liberty of the individual conscience, they led people to pick and choose which of the Catholic doctrines they would hold on to or follow. That was a problem for Rome. The danger for Rome was that the Catholic Church in America would become and would understand itself to be different from the Catholic Church in the rest of the world. Now, Catholic is a word that means, kataholos actually means like throughout the whole, but it translates most directly to universal. Catholic Church understands itself to be universal, right? It is the same in every nation around the world. So it was a problem if American Catholicism understood itself to be somehow constitutively different, right? Much as we saw with the Jewish community in America, the Catholic community in America was struggling with the pressures of modernity. And they went full anti-modernist. By they, I mean those who aligned themselves with, affiliated with, and supported the Vatican hierarchy. The Vatican hierarchy is who really went full anti-modernist. So 1907, this fellow, Pope Pius X, put out this other encyclical called Lamentabili Sane, a syllabus condemning the errors of the modernists, right? It was a very long list. It included the assertion that the church was unchangeable over and over in many different ways, and that the church was not subject to historical evolution, that the doctrine would not change according to historical change, that the truth of the church would not be answerable to or compromised by social realities in their historically contingent ways, right? The progress of dogmas is, in reality, nothing but the corruption of dogmas. That was his idea. There would be no progress. Progress suggested change. Change suggested that the original dogma, the original doctrine, was somehow partial or could be changed, right? And so that was a problem. And it insisted that scientific discovery had no bearing on the doctrine of the church. None. Just like we're not going to have the conversation, no was the answer. Then in 1910, the same Pope, Pius X, required that all clergy, preachers, theology students, and professors take the oath against modernism. It was a printed document. You had to take the oath, sign it, send it in, right? In which they personally swore to embrace the unerring teaching authority of the church, right? Quote, especially those principal truths which are directly opposed to the errors of this day, right? So anything that smacked of modern change, of progress, of modernism, of a questioning, of a response to the pressures of modernity, of any kind of compromise. They were required to take an oath against it. There would be no evolving dogmas. Facts of faith would take unquestioned precedent over facts of history. Like, it's not a conversation to be had, right? Books deemed questionable were removed from seminary libraries. Americans' library hours were severely limited. Libraries were closed for most of the week. American seminarians were cautioned by Rome to keep their enthusiasm for learning under control. And we will see next time how that official anti-modernism led to especially American innovations in what came to be known as Catholic action. Like, it did have an effect, a positive effect, in that the effect that it had was not just backing off or negative. It was active, right? So we'll see that. But quickly before we close here, Catholics in American politics, right? We sort of started there. Let's close the loop on that. The 20th century did away with a lot of the 19th century fears that Catholics couldn't fully participate in the democratic project. When John F. Kennedy entered office in 1960, there were 100 Catholics in Congress. It's the 87th Congress. It's the first column here. And Catholic is the kind of darkish yellow, lightish orange. But you can see there's 100 Catholics in Congress in 1961 when Kennedy enters office. When Biden entered office as the second Catholic president in U.S. history, following JFK, in 2021, there were 166 Catholics in Congress, which is down just a smidge from the 115th Congress, which had 168. So it has gone down, but it's, ups and downs. You see that's been happening for a while. But on the whole, it doesn't seem that Americans have rejected the possibility that Catholics can participate actively in government. Like, during the Biden campaign and even early into the presidency, his Catholicism seemed to come up very little, if at all. It was a major talking point, a major political point of the campaign of John F. Kennedy, and it was used against him by really a wide swath of the American Protestant public. There was even those who voted for Kennedy would often say, well, I'm a little worried, but I want to vote for him anyway, right? It just wasn't part of the conversation with Biden, so in anywhere near the same way. So we can see that, things have changed. It's difficult for us to even imagine the politically figured anti-Catholicism of the 19th century from this perspective, right? A majority of the Supreme Court has been Catholic since 2005. The majority of the Supreme Court has been Catholic since 2005. The Supreme Court has been comprised of almost exclusively Catholics and Jews for decades now, which is notable in a Protestant majority country, right? But anyway, so yeah, it's difficult to imagine that anti-Catholicism of the late 19th and early 20th century. But we will return in the next lecture to that era, to that time, and look at how that anti-modernism from the position of the Catholic hierarchy affected Catholic action on the ground and led to some developments which we see still active today.